Thrown in the dungeon for debt, the merchants who lost everything. Imagine losing everything, not because you stole or harmed or rebelled, but because you simply couldn't pay. In medieval England and France, debt was more than a burden. It was a life sentence. If you owed money, even a small amount, the law didn't ask why. It didn't care about your family, your health, or your future. You were thrown into a dungeon, sometimes the same day the debt was declared. No trial, no appeal, just the sound of iron doors slamming shut behind you. These were not metaphorical prisons. They were real, solid, stone-walled hells. In London, Fleet Prison and Marshalsea were infamous. In France, the Bicêtre held men who once walked with respect through markets and courts. Now, they walked barefoot through filth. Their only crime was misfortune. Medieval debtors' prisons were not correctional facilities. They were places of slow decay, stone pits, where merchants, farmers, and artisans rotted in chains for owing as little as a few shillings. Many of these men had once thrived: stall owners at bustling markets, blacksmiths forging for nobles, bakers with ovens that never cooled. But a bad harvest, a broken cart, or a missed payment could end it all. One merchant might lose his goods in a shipwreck. Another might fall ill and miss a week's earnings. Once inside, the world stopped caring. These dungeons were cold and airless, built under castles or tucked into city walls. Some had no light, no beds, just straw, lice, and wet stone. The prisoner would sit there, waiting. But for what? There was no fixed sentence, no end date. Release came only when the debt was paid. But how do you pay when you're shackled, starving, and forgotten? Some prisoners died within weeks. Others lasted months, years. Families were allowed to bring food if they could afford it. If not, you begged through a grate, or you starved. In one recorded case from 13th century France, a merchant imprisoned for 7 silver coins died, clutching a note promising repayment by his cousin. The cousin never came. In another, a cloth seller from Bordeaux was found dead after 2 winters in confinement. His debt was only for a botched dye shipment worth less than a pair of boots. Women were not spared either. Widows who inherited debt from their late husbands were imprisoned. Mothers with unpaid midwives' fees were locked away. In York, England, one woman was held in a freezing cell for 6 months because she couldn't repay the cost of her child's burial. In Rouen, a washerwoman who borrowed money for laundry soap was chained by her ankle until infection claimed her leg, and eventually her life. Children suffered too. Some debtors' children were raised in prison with their parents. These children played not in fields, but on moldy stone. They learned to walk between chains. Some never saw sunlight until they were old enough to be thrown out onto the streets, and often they too carried the debt forward, inheritance of misery. Records from London's Fleet Prison show how desperate it became. Inmates carved pleas into walls, hoping a visitor might take pity. Some tried to escape, but punishments were brutal. A failed escape meant doubled chains or solitary confinement in the hole, a pitch-black cubicle barely big enough to sit in. Rats often shared the space. Sometimes, so did the corpses of those who failed to beg enough food. Eventually, reformers began to speak out. Religious leaders, outraged by the inhumanity, preached against debtor imprisonment. The church began offering limited sanctuary, though not all parishes honored it. By the 14th century, some cities like Florence and Paris introduced workhouses where debtors could labor for release. But in England, dungeons remained filled well into the 18th century. The worst irony: many creditors knew the debtor would never pay from prison. But they wanted the punishment seen. They wanted fear. A message to the rest: failure is shame, and shame must be visible. One nobleman in 15th century Normandy had a debtor publicly shackled with a sign that read, "Let him be a mirror to the careless." The man died within 10 days, and the sign was hung again on someone else. And while we remember kings and knights and great battles, we rarely remember these lost souls. But their names still surface. Faded ink in court rolls, etched lines in prison walls, forgotten graves without markers. These were not the weak. These were simply the unlucky. Some kings eventually acknowledged the cruelty. In the 16th century, Henry VIII ordered some reforms, but they were slow and largely symbolic. Even centuries later, in the time of Charles Dickens, debtors like his own father were still imprisoned in places like the Marshalsea. Dickens' novels are haunted by this reality, not as fiction, but as memory. What makes these punishments so chilling is their silence. No trials, no cries in court, just vanishing. Men and women disappearing into stone. Sometimes they weren't even recorded as dead. They were simply no longer listed, no parchment, no name, as if debt had erased their existence entirely. And even now, echoes of that system linger. In some places today, unpaid fees or minor fines can still lead to incarceration. The faces are different, the laws have changed, but the shadow remains, the belief that poverty is a failure worth punishing. History doesn't forget cruelty, it buries it until someone decides to dig. And when you dig through the dust of old prisons, the scratches on the wall don't scream. They whisper. They say, "I was here, I mattered, and I was broken for nothing more than owing a coin I never held." The boy locked away for laughing at a knight. Imagine being a child, 14 years old, your whole life still ahead of you. The year is 1322. The place, the stone corridors of a cold, towering castle in northern France. You're a servant, nameless in the eyes of nobility, invisible unless spoken to, unless ordered. You scrub floors, polish boots, haul water. And on one particular morning, the air stiff with early frost, you make a mistake. A small one. A laugh, barely stifled, at the limp of a passing knight. It wasn't defiance, not really, just a reaction. The knight, a man of honor and violence, known for his pride and cruel temper, turns his head sharply. His armor clinks as he halts. You see his eyes narrow. A moment later, you're seized, dragged down past the torchlit halls, past the kitchens where you once served, into the bowels of the castle, the dungeon. No trial, no explanation, no goodbye, just rusted chains against bare stone. The story is real, or as real as the records whisper. The boy's name is never mentioned in royal archives, but the chronicles of local abbots, preserved in the Abbey of St. Ulrich, mention a servant boy taken to the cellars for mockery of the knighted lord of Bar-sur-Seine. They don't record what happened next, but they do record this. On the wall of that dungeon, scratched into the stone with fingernails and desperation, was a name, faded by time, written once, then never again. In medieval Europe, the idea of justice was tangled in hierarchy and cruelty. Nobles had absolute authority within their fiefs. The laugh of a servant wasn't harmless. It was treason to the fragile egos of the powerful. Knights, trained to kill from the age of 7, were seen not just as warriors, but as embodiments of order. To mock one? To imply weakness? It shattered their illusion of dominance. Castle dungeons were not designed with fairness in mind. Most were nothing more than stone pits, circular holes with no doors. Prisoners were lowered down by rope, then forgotten. You wouldn't find food, not unless someone paid for it, not unless someone remembered you. And a servant boy who mocked a knight, no one would remember him. This particular castle, historians believe, was located in the Bourgogne region, a fortress later abandoned in the 15th century after repeated peasant revolts. Archaeologists found bones in the lower chambers, small ones, children. One skeleton had a leg twisted unnaturally, possibly broken in life and never set. Some believe it could have been him, but the most haunting detail remains the inscription, the name carved into the wall, twice, side by side, then deeper, once more, as if trying to make sure someone would know he'd been there. Emile, just that, No surname, no plea, just a trace of a life recorded in the language of suffering. Why would such a small act, laughter, warrant a lifetime of silence? Because medieval Europe was built on fear and control. Lords feared rebellion, knights feared weakness, and servants, children, were taught that obedience was life. Disobedience, even accidental, was death. In those times, there was no concept of children's rights, no protective laws shielding the vulnerable. A servant's worth was measured in toil and silence. Any disruption of that balance, no matter how minor, was seen as dangerous. One moment of perceived disrespect could cost a life. This wasn't an isolated case. Throughout 14th century France and England, records show numerous instances of peasants, servants, and even children imprisoned or executed for minor slights. One boy was flogged to death for dropping a tray. A young girl vanished after interrupting a noble's hunting feast. Another servant was locked in a cellar for stealing a single loaf, his bones found years later, curled beside a rusty chain. There was no justice for them. Trials, when they occurred, were swift and one-sided. Nobility judged nobility. Commoners didn't stand a chance. And children, especially orphaned or bonded ones, had no advocates, no protection. Many were seen as property. The story of Emile, if that was his name, remains a chilling reminder of how power, when unchecked, distorts justice. In modern courtrooms, laughter might be rude. In 1322, it was a death sentence. And what of the knight? His name is believed to be Sir Alaric de Montreuil, a minor noble known more for his brutality than his battlefield glory. He vanished from historical records after 1327. Rumors suggest he was killed in a tavern brawl by a soldier who once served under him. Others say he simply died of plague. No punishment, no memory, just another echo of unchecked power dissolving into time. Yet Emile's scratch on the wall remains. The castle may be rubble now, the noble line extinct, but a boy's desperate act of remembrance, etched with bloody fingers into stone, outlasted them both. Sometimes, history isn't written by the victors. It's scratched, painfully, by the forgotten. That name, carved into silence, still speaks. Even now, when historians gather in silent stone ruins, when candlelight flickers across ancient walls, they pause at that name, Emile, the boy who laughed, the boy who vanished, the boy who through pain carved his place into eternity. When prisoners paid to feed themselves or starve, imagine being locked in a cold, damp cell in the bowels of a medieval prison, not for murder, treason, or theft, but simply for lacking the money to pay a fine, a debt, or perhaps just for crossing the wrong noble. Now imagine that once you're in that cell, your punishment doesn't just end with confinement. Instead, survival itself becomes a financial burden. This was the brutal reality for countless prisoners across medieval Europe, where incarceration was not just a sentence, it was a bill. A bill that you had to keep paying, day after day, or die in the dark. In the prisons of medieval England, France, and much of Europe, the concept of state-funded care didn't exist. Jails were privately run or maintained by local lords, sheriffs, or city authorities. These institutions were not designed for rehabilitation or even justice in the modern sense. They were warehouses of bodies, often temporary holding spaces until trial, ransom, or death. But behind those iron bars, a darker economy thrived. Jailers weren't paid by the crown. Instead, they earned their living through fees collected from the very people they imprisoned. The prisoner's daily life was a catalog of suffering monetized. Food, that cost extra. Straw to sleep on instead of cold stone, pay up. A blanket, candle, writing materials, the removal of your shackles, all came at a price. Even the chains themselves, the very symbols of your captivity, were rented to you. If you couldn't afford them, you might go without, but that wasn't a mercy. It often meant being left to rot in solitary misery, ignored, unfed, unseen. Some prisoners came from wealthy families who could send money or food parcels, but many were destitute. For them, survival hinged on the charity of strangers, or what they could beg through the bars of their cells. Accounts from the time describe gaunt hands reaching out from iron grates, whispering for alms, bread, or even a crust of stale rye. Priests sometimes visited to offer spiritual comfort, but more practically, they brought coins, loaves, and pottage. Occasionally, public collections were held for the poorest inmates, but more often, their fate was left to the cold. In the 13th and 14th centuries, prison conditions varied wildly depending on one's class and crime. Wealthier prisoners might reside in a relatively comfortable chamber, sometimes even receiving visitors and food deliveries from local inns. In stark contrast, the poor, those imprisoned for debt or minor offenses, languished in disease-ridden holes where rats were more reliable than mercy. These cells were dark, wet, and filled with the stench of rot and despair. Debtors, in particular, faced a cruel fate. If you owed money and couldn't pay, you might be thrown into prison with no timeline for release. There was no bankruptcy court, no organized repayment plans. The jailers, ironically, demanded more money just to keep you alive inside. This paradox destroyed thousands. The longer you stayed imprisoned, the more you owed, and the less likely you were to ever leave. Some died still in debt, their lives literally consumed by the interest of survival. Chroniclers and clerics recorded the despair. One French friar noted a man who died with a note clutched in his hand, addressed to no one, begging simply, "Please, I am still here." The plea was found only after his death, days after the cell had gone quiet. In another case, a woman imprisoned in London was known to cry out for bread every night for 3 months before the silence came. Her name was never recorded. Only the sound of her voice remained in the memories of guards who dared not speak of it. Some jails even had fee charts posted, lists of how much it would cost for a bowl of porridge, a clean tunic, or a candle to read by. These were not luxuries. In cold months, prisoners froze to death without fire. In summer, disease bred in the sweat-soaked straw. There were cases where prisoners pooled their meager funds to save one among them, someone younger, someone sicker, hoping they might survive long enough to reach a relative or a kind-hearted priest. The others knew they would not. This economy of suffering was deliberate. Authorities knew it placed pressure on families, towns, and guilds to pay ransoms or settle debts. It was a system engineered to turn pain into profit. And in some prisons, even death cost money. Families were charged to retrieve bodies. Those who couldn't pay were buried in mass graves outside the city, unnamed, unmourned. They were swept away like refuse, their only legacy a forgotten cell and unpaid fees scrawled in a ledger. Reform didn't arrive quickly. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries that public pressure and Enlightenment ideals began to change how prisoners were treated. The concept of debtors' prisons slowly faded, replaced by systems still flawed, but at least governed by some semblance of humane oversight. Writers like Charles Dickens helped expose the cruelty of such institutions to a wider world, but it took centuries to undo the normalcy of starvation behind stone walls. For those who lived and died in these prisons, the weight of history remains unmarked. Their names were never etched in monuments, but in the silence of their cells, they left behind something else, a lesson, a chilling echo from a time when survival had a price tag, and justice was measured in coins. And if no one paid, you vanished, not with a scream, but with silence, cold, quiet, forgotten. The Castle Pit Dungeons, prisoners buried alive in stone wells. They were called oubliettes, places of forgetting. Hidden deep beneath the stone bones of medieval castles, these were not prisons in the modern sense. They were pits, wells, shafts carved straight into the earth and lined with cold, unfeeling stone. There were no doors, no guards standing watch, no torchlight flickering at the end of a corridor, just a single opening above, through which prisoners were lowered, or dropped, and sometimes never seen again. Imagine that descent. First, a rope, then silence, then the moment the rope stops moving, not because it hit bottom, but because someone decided not to lower it further, or worse, pulled it back up. You call out, no answer. You wait, still no sound. You stare upward, and all you see is a shrinking circle of daylight, slowly devoured by dusk. And then, darkness. For many, this was not a place of punishment. It was a place of erasure. Historical records across Europe mention these pit dungeons, though their documentation is often buried under the more theatrical stories of Iron Maidens and rack torture. But the oubliette was more insidious. It required no blood, no whip, no visible mark. It was a punishment of negation. To be placed in the pit was not to serve a sentence. It was to be removed from the world. Many castles across England, France, and Germany still contain remnants of these holes, narrow shafts barely wide enough to accommodate a standing human. Some are so deep that echoes never return. In Caernarfon Castle, Wales, and Chillon Castle, Switzerland, these pits can still be seen, sealed off by iron grates, silent memorials to a cruelty buried beneath grandeur. But what was it like inside? Darkness complete, damp stone that sweat with cold, rats, insects, molded straw, or nothing at all. You sat, you shivered, you scratched the walls not for escape, but for memory, names etched with fingernails or bone, a tally of days that blurred into nights, indistinguishable in the pitch. And above you, life continued. Nobles feasted, soldiers laughed, the castle breathed, but you had been exhaled, discarded like a bad thought. These dungeons were often used for those considered inconvenient, political enemies, disgraced nobility, traitorous lovers, and occasionally even servants who heard too much. In some records, there are mentions of prisoners who lived in these pits for weeks, surviving on scraps of bread lowered sporadically, or water that seeped through the walls. But others? They were left without food, without water, buried alive, not in dirt, but in silence. And the worst part? The oubliette didn't kill quickly. It let you rot slowly, physically, mentally. To be forgotten was to lose your name, your story, your tether to time. Some prisoners clawed their way into madness. Others stopped moving altogether. And occasionally, chillingly, when castles were abandoned, their successors found skeletons curled at the bottom of these holes, mouths agape, as if still whispering for help centuries later. Archaeological digs have unearthed bone fragments, buttons, bits of fabric clinging to stone in a damp hush. And always scratches, endless scratches. Not escape attempts, but timekeeping. Or perhaps desperation sculpted into the walls. The dead telling their stories the only way they could. Why did they exist? Because medieval power didn't require spectacle. It required fear. The oubliette wasn't about execution. It was about disappearance. A warning not shouted, but whispered. Anyone could be erased. Your life could vanish without a blade ever drawn, a hole in the earth, and no one above willing to pull the rope back up. And it wasn't just the pit that buried them. It was the silence of those who knew they were down there and said nothing. Imagine the weight of that, knowing someone was beneath your feet, knowing the castle itself had digested them. At what point do you stop hearing their voice? At what point does your own heart harden enough to forget they existed? That's the true horror of these dungeons, not the depth of the pit, but the depth of human indifference. Because forgetting someone takes more than time. It takes choice. And when castles were abandoned, those pits remained, unsealed, unspoken, unacknowledged. They are the quietest graveyards in history, stone mouths that never stop swallowing. And if you ever visit one, if you ever stand above an old oubliette, looking down into that endless black, listen carefully. You might not hear screams, but you may hear something worse. Nothing at all. Innocent but accused. The millers blamed for flooding a village. What happens when the earth breaks? and someone must be blamed. In the 13th century, deep within the patchwork of medieval England, the economy of a village did not rest on coin, but on the grindstone. The mill, simple, powerful, was the lifeblood of the community. It turned grain into bread, survival into sustenance. Watermills lined the rivers, fed by carefully built dams. Those structures were often unstable, constructed by hand, reinforced with faith. Faith that the river would behave, faith that stone and timber would hold. But rivers are wild things, and when they break loose, they do not ask permission. A dam broke. The water surged through the valley like a beast released. It smashed fences, uprooted trees, collapsed walls, and crushed livestock beneath the force of nature unbound. Entire homes vanished under mud and stone. Fields were flattened, and when the sun rose again, it revealed ruin, drenched and cold and full of silence. Someone had to pay. The village turned to the millers, not because they were guilty, not because anyone had proof, but because they were near the dam, because they worked the water, because someone had to be held responsible, and the millers were visible, accessible, vulnerable. The justice system in the 13th century was not built for truth. It was built for order, for appearances, and above all, for punishment. The two men, father and son, were dragged from their home. They were not given lawyers. There were no trials by jury. Their fate was decided by local magistrates, noblemen who viewed justice through the lens of control, not compassion. They were taken to the dungeons beneath the Lord's manor, dank, narrow stone cells carved like wounds into the earth. No light save a torch once a day, no water save what trickled through the cracks. And every morning they were whipped, not to gather information, not to reveal truth, to extract a confession. A forced confession in medieval England was as good as gospel. The logic was twisted. If the body breaks, the soul is laid bare. And so they whipped them. For hours, days, weeks. The millers screamed, then whispered, then stopped making noise at all. The younger man broke first. He told them what they wanted to hear, that he had failed to tend the dam, that he had ignored warnings, that he had done it out of laziness or greed or whatever the Lord's men needed to justify what they had already decided. The father refused, for a time. Then, one morning, when they came with ropes and blades, he nodded silently. That was enough. The record shows that both men confessed, and so they were forgiven. They were released, bones misaligned, minds undone. The village offered no apology. There was no compensation. The millers returned to a life that no longer welcomed them. Their property had been taken. Their names were soiled. Their friends looked the other way. But the dam? It had not been tampered with. Later records from royal engineers, brought in after the flood threatened more territory, revealed the truth. The dam had failed due to a structural flaw in its base. It had been poorly designed from the start. It had cracked long before. It was destined to fail. The real failure was not in the miller's hands. It was in the silence of those who knew, in a Lord who needed someone to blame, in a justice system that prized confessions over facts. This was not a unique story. Throughout medieval Europe, infrastructure failures, collapsing bridges, crumbling dikes, flooded streets, were often followed by arrests, not of builders, not of inspectors, but of those closest to the disaster, the poor, the voiceless, the visible. They were punished for proximity, punished for being in the way. Whipping as confession wasn't just cruelty, it was policy. The very law expected pain to produce truth. It was common belief that only those without guilt could withstand the rack or lash without yielding. Of course, this overlooked something. Everyone breaks. Pain doesn't prove guilt. It only proves pain. And millers? They were always suspect. They handled grain, wealth, and measurements, things the average villager mistrusted. The stereotype of the greedy miller thrived, even in folk songs and tavern tales. So when things went wrong, It was easy to point to the one at the wheel of the grindstone. They were seen as manipulators of flow, of water, of food, of fate. But this wasn't folklore. This was law enforced by iron. The manor court records describe their imprisonment in neutral terms: held for questioning, punished for negligence. But the entries hide the truth behind passive voice. There is no mention of the beatings, no ink spared on the scars, just the final line: released after satisfactory testimony. A phrase that meant, "We broke them, and now we're done." The flood had consequences far beyond the millers. Crops failed. Livestock numbers dropped. Children grew up without homes. But no reforms were made. No dams rebuilt to new standards. Because once someone was blamed, truly blamed, the need to fix the system vanished. Blame is cheaper than change. Even now, modern historians find the case buried in scattered documents, marginal notes, and faded clerical logs. It's not a headline, it's a shadow. And maybe that's where the truth lives. In the corners, in the cells no one cleans, in the echoes no one names. The millers were innocent, but innocence meant nothing. Not when the river roared, not when the Lord needed peace, and not when justice was just another kind of flood. Their legacy is not a monument, it is a warning. Trial by ordeal. If you didn't burn, you were guilty. If you didn't burn, you were guilty. Ready for YouTube narration. Imagine standing in front of a silent crowd, your hands trembling, not from fear of guilt, but from the knowledge that what happens next could destroy your life, regardless of truth. This was justice in parts of medieval Europe, not law as we know it, but trial by ordeal, a brutal gamble between flesh and fire. You were told God would judge you, that the divine would protect the innocent. But the test? It was red-hot iron. In this ritual, the accused would be forced to carry a glowing bar of metal, sometimes 3 paces, sometimes 9. The iron was heated until it seared like a brand. The task wasn't about endurance, it was a performance of supposed innocence. If you dropped it, or faltered, or screamed, people watched, priests watched, lords watched. They took note. Then came the waiting. Your hands were wrapped in linen, sealed, and left for 3 days, not in comfort, but in darkness. If, on the 3rd day, the wound was infected or failed to heal cleanly, you were guilty. If the flesh healed too fast, that too could mean guilt. The reasoning? Only a witch or devil's servant could cheat pain so easily. The only safe outcome was a slow, ordinary scab, a miracle of moderation. Anything else meant punishment. This wasn't rare. From England to the German states, from France to Scandinavia, ordeal by iron was seen as divine proof. Justice through heat. It was used not just for theft or assault, but even for matters of land disputes, marriage fidelity, and heresy. In some towns, the iron itself was treated as sacred. Priests would bless the tools before the ritual. Holy men oversaw the pain, believing they were instruments of God's will. And it wasn't always iron. There were other forms. Ordeal by boiling water, where you plunged your arm into a cauldron to retrieve a stone, or ordeal by fire walking, crossing hot coals without flinching, or even ordeal by cold water, where the accused was bound and tossed into a lake. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent. But drowning was a common side effect of truth. Women were not spared. In fact, they were often subjected to more degrading forms of the ordeal. A woman accused of infidelity could be forced to hold a red-hot iron to prove her loyalty. A midwife accused of witchcraft might be subjected to boiling water. Her hands, her tools, her very livelihood boiled away in minutes. And it was public. Entire villages gathered. Children clutched mothers' skirts. Men crossed themselves and whispered prayers. The outcome was spectacle. The pain was theater. And the scars? Those were lifetime verdicts. Even if you were declared innocent, your wounds could be permanent. Burn damage, loss of function, or simply the shame of having to prove yourself through torment. Historical records from the 9th to 13th centuries show hundreds of such ordeals. In some cases, chroniclers wrote that God showed mercy and healed the wounds swiftly, but often they noted the smell of scorched skin, the screams, the silence that followed. One woman in 11th century Burgundy was forced to carry iron for being too outspoken against a noble. She healed quickly, uneasy. They burned her again, believing her defiance was proof of sorcery. Eventually, the church grew uneasy. By the 13th century, Pope Innocent III questioned the legitimacy of these trials. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, clergy were forbidden from participating. Without the Church's endorsement, the rituals began to fade, but the scars they left, both physical and cultural, persisted for generations. In Iceland, where sagas recorded centuries of social tension, trial by ordeal sometimes replaced feud and revenge killings. In one case, a man accused of theft was ordered to retrieve an iron ring from boiling water. When he hesitated, his enemies jeered that the delay proved guilt. He dipped his hand. 3 days later, the wounds festered. His fate? Banishment. Exile into the freezing wilderness with no supplies. A slow death written not by a judge, but by blisters. The psychological toll was devastating. Those who survived bore not just burns, but the shame of being publicly tested. Even the innocent, once proven so, often found their reputations stained. Whispers followed them. He was accused. She needed iron to prove her soul. In communities bound by fear and faith, suspicion didn't end with innocence. It echoed through generations. Ordeals even shaped local folklore. In parts of Bohemia, people said witches could charm iron to cool in their hands. In Wales, tales spoke of men who survived boiling water by bargaining with fairies. These stories reveal a haunting truth. People knew the system wasn't justice. They invented magic just to explain how anyone could escape it. It wasn't just physical trial. It was spiritual warfare, cast into the skin. And perhaps the most terrifying part was how accepted it was. Entire villages believed they were watching divine judgment. Parents brought their children to witness righteousness. Priests preached about the hand of God, while the hand of man held the fire. Even after the decline of formal ordeals, the logic lingered. In early witch trials of the 15th century, confessions extracted by torture were seen as undeniable proof. If you screamed under pain, you were guilty. If you didn't scream, still guilty. A no-win system, a cruelty loop, trial by ordeal without the fire, but with the same result, torment standing in for truth. And today, we don't call it ordeal, but echoes remain. A survivor of trauma is judged by how convincingly they weep. A wrongfully accused man is told his calmness makes him suspicious. We still conflate suffering with truth, and sometimes the world still demands that the innocent bleed just to be believed. So when we look back at the red-hot iron, it's not just to shudder at the cruelty. It's to recognize the pattern. Justice must not be performance. Pain must not be proof. And no one, ever, should have to walk through fire just to be seen as human. Chained until madness. The prisoner who forgot his own name. Imagine waking in darkness and never seeing light again. Not for days, not for months, for years. You reach out, stone, cold, damp. The smell of rot in the air, the weight of metal at your ankles. Time becomes a blur. Memory fades like chalk washed by rain. And eventually, you forget even your name. The year is 1374. The Holy Roman Empire sprawls across Europe like a patchwork quilt of power. In one of its many German principalities, in a modest town near the main river, a man is recorded as having been imprisoned. His crime? Unknown. His name? Forgotten. His cell? A lightless chamber beneath the jailhouse, barely the size of a coffin, stood upright. No window, no warmth, no mercy. He is referenced in a real surviving town ledger, a brief mention in a tax document, strangely, as the jailer requested additional funds for feeding the silent one below. The document, preserved in regional archives near Würzburg, notes that the prisoner had been there since the plague first visited us, which would place his imprisonment around 1348. That's nearly 3 decades of darkness. Witnesses say he did not speak, not because he refused, but because he no longer knew how. He would mutter syllables, broken, meaningless fragments. When asked his name, he'd tremble and whisper, "I was someone once." This is not an exaggeration. Medieval records, while sparse and often cold, capture glimpses of such fates. Men and women who were arrested, forgotten, buried alive in bureaucratic silence. And once memory breaks, identity soon follows. Back then, prisons weren't institutions of rehabilitation. They were cages, temporary, sometimes eternal. Dungeons in the 14th century were pits, holes, or stone closets, lightless, airless, and damp. You were thrown in with little ceremony, often no trial, and if no one remembered to petition for your release, you stayed, sometimes for life, sometimes longer. And what could land you in one? Almost anything. Debts, suspicions, superstition, a wrong look, a bitter neighbor's accusation, or simply being in the wrong place during a noble's passing parade. Justice was arbitrary and cruel. This prisoner, this man who lost his name, is one of history's ghost stories, not because he's a myth, but because his identity was erased before his life ended. That's the horror, the slow erosion of self in the absence of sunlight, conversation, meaning. It wasn't torture in the traditional sense. It was worse. It was neglect that became annihilation. What happens to a mind in the dark for that long? Modern psychology offers some insight. Sensory deprivation, especially extreme and prolonged, leads to hallucinations, memory fragmentation, language regression. Without external input, the brain turns inward. Dreams mix with memory. Fiction and fact blur. Names, ours, others, drift into fog. Without language, thought itself dissolves into emotional impressions, fear, hunger, confusion. And when time has no markers, you stop understanding it at all. We don't know his age when he was imprisoned, but when he was finally removed from that stone box, by a new jailer cleaning out the lower cells, he could not walk. His bones had reshaped to the fetal posture he'd adopted in sleep. His eyes were nearly white, blind from decades in darkness. And when they took him outside, he screamed. The sunlight was unbearable, alien, agonizing. He died days later. Some say his heart failed. Others suggest he simply gave up. The ledger marked his passing as relief of burden. No name, no kin, just one less mouth to feed. But the townsfolk whispered, because while the church buried him in the pauper's field, a few older citizens recalled a name, a merchant's apprentice, who vanished after an accusation of theft during the plague panic. He was innocent, they said, just afraid. He'd hidden behind the baker's house. The guards found him, took him in, and forgot him. 30 years of rot for a moment of fear. Stories like his are not anomalies in medieval Europe. They are cautionary echoes. The same town records mention at least 4 other inmates held without confession for periods exceeding 10 years. Some went mad, some starved. One was found gnawing his own hands. The lesson here is not just about cruelty. It's about the power of silence, of bureaucracy, of forgetfulness. When a person is buried alive by a system, and no one speaks their name, they die long before their heart stops. Memory is what makes a life visible, and when that's stripped away, all that's left is a shadow, wandering a stone cell, speaking nonsense syllables to no one. Even now, scholars call him the Silent One. But maybe, once, he was Johann, or Emil, or Otto. Maybe he had dreams, a mother, a lover. Maybe he once sang, but all that remains is the echo of someone who lived and died in the dark, whose only recorded identity was his inability to remember it. He vanished into a silence so deep, even history had to wispy. Arrested for helping a stranger. The law of suspicion. Imagine a knock at your door on a cold night. A stranger, disheveled and desperate, asking for a drink of water or a place to rest. In today's world, helping them might be seen as an act of kindness, but in parts of medieval Europe, that act could become a death sentence. The law didn't just punish criminals, it punished anyone who might have aided them, whether intentionally or not. This was the law of suspicion, an unwritten but deadly truth in many cities, where proximity to guilt meant guilt itself, and the cost of kindness was often imprisonment, or worse. In medieval towns and cities, fear and paranoia were powerful tools of control. When a crime occurred, especially something violent, political, or scandalous, the authorities didn't just hunt for the perpetrator, they widened the net. Anyone who had contact with the accused could be rounded up. Family members, neighbors, acquaintances, and sometimes even strangers who had simply offered food, shelter, or sympathy. In some jurisdictions, it was enough to have shared a word, a glance, or a simple gesture of mercy with the wrong person. There were countless cases where this played out with chilling results. A woman might offer a crust of bread to a man bleeding on the roadside. A farmer might give a night's rest in the barn to a traveler caught in the rain. If that person was later accused of theft, heresy, rebellion, or anything at all, the punishment did not stop with them. The helpful soul, however well-meaning, was now part of the crime. Arrested, chained, interrogated. Families were torn apart in the name of law, simply for showing compassion. This wasn't always about crime, it was about control. Authorities wanted to discourage any form of resistance or subversion. By making kindness dangerous, they created a society where fear outweighed compassion. People began to look away from suffering, to avoid eye contact with the needy, to close their doors and shutter their hearts. A neighbor's misfortune became a threat to your own survival. Better to remain indifferent than be dragged into someone else's accusation. In 14th century France, one town infamously detained an entire household after a wounded man collapsed near their stable. The family had dragged him inside, wrapped his wounds, and offered bread. Days later, guards arrived. They were charged with aiding a traitor. The man had fled a rebellion. The family hadn't known, but that didn't matter. Their kindness had branded them. The parents were imprisoned. The children were separated and placed in workhouses. The man died 2 days later from infection. The family was never reunited. In England, during the reign of Edward III, laws of suspicion were heavily enforced during periods of rebellion and political unrest. Harboring a fugitive, even unknowingly, could bring charges of treason. And treason, in those times, meant death. Trials were swift, records were questionable, and once accused, proving innocence was often impossible. Entire estates were seized on such pretexts. In one record, a widow who gave water to a knight she thought wounded in war was accused of aiding a deserter. She was hanged in the public square. Jails swelled with the innocent and the unfortunate, not because they had acted with malice, but because they had acted with mercy. The idea that helping someone could be criminal turned entire communities against their own humanity, and those who dared to help anyway, quietly, secretly, did so knowing it might cost them everything. Still, in the shadows, there were those who resisted. Underground networks of monks, nuns, and healers would smuggle food to the accused. Some townsfolk whispered prayers for the imprisoned. Others left bread at cell windows under cover of night. The law of suspicion turned hospitality into a gamble. You could lose your home, your family, your freedom, your life, all for a single gesture of kindness made in ignorance. It's a chilling reminder of how fear can weaponize justice, and how quickly the noble act of helping a stranger can be rewritten as a crime. Over time, people learned to hesitate, to ask questions before giving aid, to guard their generosity like a secret. Because in a world ruled by suspicion, being kind was never safe. It was a risk, a quiet rebellion against the machinery of fear. Even as modern justice systems evolved, the echo of this fear remained. The scars of generations who were taught to distrust compassion are still visible in laws that criminalize aid to migrants, that penalize the poor for sheltering each other, that question the motives of anyone helping without reward. The law of suspicion may no longer be carved into the books, but its spirit haunts the margins of legality even now. And so we look back not with nostalgia, but with warning. Because history is not only a story of what was, but a lesson in what must not return. The prisons once filled with Good Samaritans remind us suspicion can be more dangerous than guilt. And sometimes the bravest act is simply to help. Starved as punishment, not accident. Starvation is often imagined as a tragedy of neglect, an accident of circumstance. But in the dark stone corridors of the Tower of London, it was something else, something calculated, something deliberate. Starvation was not merely a consequence, it was a tool, a weapon, a slow, silent cruelty used not to kill, but to break. The Tower of London, fortress, palace, prison, stood as a symbol of power for centuries. Its walls echoed with the footsteps of kings, queens, and those they sought to silence. Within its cells, high-born prisoners and political dissidents waited for verdicts they already knew. But behind the pageantry of execution and show trials, something quieter unfolded. They called it reduction. Prisoners were not simply denied food, they were weakened by design. Fed just enough to survive, but not enough to resist. Meals withheld, rations halved, days without bread, water thin with filth, not punishment for a crime, but preparation for an interrogation. Historical records from the Tudor and Plantagenet periods tell of detainees who grew feeble and disoriented in their cells, not by disease, not by injury, but by calculated deprivation. Starving a man did not leave visible marks, no bruises to scandalize foreign courts, no bleeding to stir public sympathy, but it made them pliable, exhausted, easier to manipulate when questioning came. Some prisoners begged to speak, if only to trade words for a crust of bread. This was by design. One of the most infamous examples was Sir Miles Partridge, imprisoned during the turbulent reign of Henry VIII. He was a minor courtier, small in title, but dangerously loyal to those who opposed the king's religious reforms. Letters from the Tower suggest his meals were withheld in the days leading up to his questioning. Guards recorded his complaints of dizziness, of his tongue sticking to his teeth. His final confession was incoherent, almost delirious, but it was signed. And that was all that mattered. Women, too, were not spared. Lady Jane Grey's husband, Guilford Dudley, was rumored to have been starved to the brink of collapse before his execution. Some say he wept not from fear, but from the weakness in his body. He was a nobleman made small, and the Tower was very good at making the powerful feel powerless. In the bowels of the Tower, not every prisoner was tortured with racks and flames. Some were tortured with emptiness. Imagine it. Locked in a stone cell, with no light but a single torch flickering hours away. Days pass. Your stomach twists on itself. Your strength drains. Thoughts slow. Reality begins to blur. A loaf of bread becomes a fantasy. A sip of wine, a hallucination. You'd trade anything for it, even truth. That was the point. The monarchy didn't need bruises to break you, just time and hunger. Even when food was offered, it became part of the cruelty. Some were fed only after they confessed. Others had to beg for sustenance. It was a ritual of control, a reminder that you no longer owned your own body. And perhaps most insidious of all, many starved not because they were forgotten, but because they were remembered, because their silence was inconvenient, because their strength threatened something greater than their crimes. Records show that jailers received specific instructions. Keep him quiet. Wear her down. Loosen his tongue. Starvation was written between the lines, a policy cloaked in silence, unwritten but deeply understood. Not all prisoners died. Some survived, but none ever walked out of those cells unchanged. their faces thinner, their steps weaker, their memories fogged, their wills fractured. You can still visit the tower today. Tour guides will show you the traitor's gate, the scaffold site, the executioner's block. But if you listen closely in the lower chambers, if you lean against the cold stone where sunlight rarely reached, you might feel it, the emptiness that once lived there, the ghost of hunger, the slow unraveling of dignity, bite by stolen bite. Because starvation was never a mistake. It was a message, a whisper through gritted teeth, you are no longer in control. And in the Tower of London, that whisper echoed louder than any scream. The prison that flooded every winter. What if your sentence was never meant to end in chains, but in water? In the heart of York, where the River Ouse cuts like a vein through stone and shadow, stood a prison known more for its damp rot than its walls. It was a small, grim fortress of neglect, nestled so close to the riverbank that its foundation absorbed the current like a sponge. They called it the Castle Jail. Not a castle by any romantic measure, but a ruin dressed in cruelty. It was here, in the 13th and 14th centuries, that men and women were locked beneath the city. The worst of them, the forgotten of them, the unlucky, all dragged below into a stone belly known to flood when the rain came and the river swelled. And every winter it did. The waters rose with cruel predictability, ice-laced, freezing, muddy. The guards knew. The magistrates knew. The townspeople knew. It was simply how things were. Winter arrived, the river bloated, and the prison filled like a drowning cellar. The lowest cells became tombs, the air thick with damp decay. Chains clinked above the surface until they didn't. No one came to rescue them. Records from the time are vague, as if the horror couldn't be written directly. But the patterns are there. Reports of bodies found after thaws, prison rolls that ended without explanation. Archaeological digs, centuries later, confirmed what whispers had said all along. Iron restraints embedded in walls too close to silt. Skeletal remains fused to stone, still shackled. The design was not accident. It was disregard. York was a powerful city, a place of law and commerce and religion. But its prison, the one beneath the royal court, was built where no one wanted to build. Low, cold, damp. It was never meant for justice. It was meant for disappearance. Prisoners were sent for crimes as varied as debt, trespassing, heresy. Some weren't criminals at all, just those who couldn't pay their way out. A system where guilt was negotiable, but chains were absolute. Once thrown in, you waited for judgment, for death, for spring. And the water came with ritual cruelty. Not sudden, never sudden. It crept, first as puddles, then as pools, then waves. Inmates chained to walls could not climb. They could not stand. They could only wait as icy water rose to their knees, their ribs, their throats. Some screamed, some prayed, some whispered their names until they drowned with them. No guard was punished. No system was changed. Year after year, it happened. And year after year, it was buried in silence. One letter from a 14th century monk survives. He wrote of a place where the river takes its tithe in men each winter, and no priest will bless it. A place cursed by indifference, not intent. But in some ways, that was worse. A death planned is murder. A death permitted again and again is design. Modern historians estimate dozens, perhaps hundreds, died this way over generations, not by execution, but by engineered negligence, not because they were meant to die, but because no one cared if they lived. In time, the prison was restructured, elevated, but not before the earth beneath remembered. During excavations, archaeologists found a layer of bones, stacked not like graves, but like debris. Among them, rusted shackles, rotted wood fragments, coins worn smooth. Evidence not just of death, but of waiting, of abandonment, of a sentence no one wrote, but everyone enforced. Today, York thrives. Tourists walk the walls. Boats glide across the River Ouse. But below the surface, stories remain. Some say you can still hear chains in the current. Some say the river learned its appetite from man. And when winter returns, when the river swells again, the earth remembers. Because the water was never the executioner. It was just the stage. And every year, we gave it players. Those who died in the Castle Gale were rarely named in the annals of time. They were not knights or nobles. They left no monuments, only scratches, names etched into the stone walls by trembling hands, some still visible centuries later, some carved prayers, others dates, some just left a mark, proof that they were here, that they waited, that they drowned with dignity no one else remembered to give them. Sometimes the water rose quickly, cutting short even those final acts. Inmates who resisted could be clubbed unconscious before the flood even arrived. Others died of exposure long before the water came, cold settling into their lungs like punishment. But in the worst winters, it was the river that took them. A methodical, rising executioner with no sword, no trial, no end. Imagine it now, being locked in a stone room, your feet chained, your body stiff with cold. You hear the rush of water seeping in, slow at first, then faster, then louder. No windows, no exits, just the sound of life narrowing to a single rising level. You shout, but your voice doesn't matter. You're not being punished for what you did. You're drowning because you were left where no one cared what happened next. Some priests protested. A few monks raised their voices in texts that survive only as fragments. One fragment reads, "He who is left to die and not buried was buried by God," as if only divine hands remained when man turned away. Over time, public hangings replaced secret drownings, because executions became spectacle. They were cleaner, controlled. But castle jails' flooded cells were no less deadly, just quieter, easier to forget. But the river never forget. It remembers them in the way it swells, in the way it presses against the stones even now. It does not rage. It repeats, patient, ritualistic. And as floodwaters rise with each passing year, with climate change, with negligence once again in the air, we are reminded that the past isn't past. It's rising. So we must ask ourselves, what spaces have we built too low? What places have we left too close to the water? What lives are still chained in silence because we do not want to hear them? Castle Jail is now gone. But beneath York's streets, the ghosts are not. Not because they haunt, but because they were never freed. Their chains may be rusted away, but the question remains, how many more winters must pass before we stop drowning the forgotten? No trial, no release. Forgotten by the court system. Imagine being taken from your home, not with violence but with quiet authority. You're told it's temporary, just a question or two, just a mistake to clear up. But then the door closes, the cell locks, and nobody comes back. Hours become days, days become years. This is not the story of one man. It is the buried reality of a forgotten system, a medieval world where being suspected was enough to disappear. In 1295, a Frenchman was imprisoned for suspicion of theft. He was not charged. He was not tried. His name appears only once, in a record noting his confinement. The next time it appears is in a death entry. 18 years later, same prison, same cell. No one knows what he allegedly stole. No one knows if anyone even remembered he was there. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Europe, records from the 13th to 15th centuries reveal dozens, perhaps hundreds, of prisoners who were simply never processed. They weren't condemned criminals. They weren't sentenced. They were paused, forgotten between accusation and judgment. Limbo with chains. Jails in this era were not designed for comfort or even order. They were holding pens, intended for the short term. But bureaucracy was slow. Corruption was rampant. And in some places, records were kept on scraps of parchment vulnerable to rot, fire, or misfiling. If a scribe miswrote your name, or a clerk forgot your case, that was it. You vanished from law. You became a ghost in iron. Sometimes, a jailer might keep a man alive out of duty or greed. Families were expected to provide food. No visitors, no meals. In London, some prisoners bartered personal items, boots, combs, even their belts, for crumbs from other inmates. In Avignon, a man imprisoned on hearsay starved to death. His final plea, scrawled in coal on a cell wall, read, "I wait for God, none else." Not all forgotten prisoners were unknown. Some were inconvenient. A lord's bastard son, a witness to the wrong betrayal, a merchant who owed the wrong man. When trials were political, vanishing someone was simpler than executing them. No records, no rebellion, just absence. And when relatives inquired, they were told nothing, or warned to stop asking. Women suffered quietly. Some were held for immoral behavior or rumored witchcraft, and simply never released. In Hamburg, a nun accused of unholy thoughts was jailed beneath a convent and left there until her death. Her name, erased from parish documents, was found only in the prison ledger, marked as the Silent One. And there were children, orphans accused of pickpocketing, street boys blamed for broken windows. In Rouen, a child of 12 was held for suspicion of arson. No trial date was ever set. His skeleton was discovered decades later when the prison was renovated, still in chains. Why did it happen? Part of it was fear. The legal systems were overwhelmed. Judges were scarce. Trials were costly. If someone was poor or foreign or politically inconvenient, it was easier to remove them than risk a scene. And there was no legal recourse, no public defender, no clock ticking down the sentence, just silence. And yet, even in silence, traces remain. Court rolls with crossed-out names, ledger pages with gaps, prison walls with scratched calendars counted in notches, marks of human souls trying to hold on to time, trying not to forget themselves when the world already had. Some prisoners lived not in cells, but in converted basements, cisterns, or even old wells, spaces not meant for humans. In Prague, a ledger from the 14th century refers to a stone oubliette, literally, a place of forgetting. Prisoners were lowered in by rope and never seen again. Food, if any, was tossed down. One record describes bones found beside scratch marks circling the base. No name, no charge, just silence. What's most terrifying is not the violence, it's the bureaucracy. Many of these cases were not hidden by cruelty, but by paper. The accused became names on lists, shifted between clerks, copied with errors, or simply lost when a document was damaged or discarded. In one case, a man arrested in Paris was assumed to have been transferred, but no one confirmed. No one checked. He was rediscovered when renovations uncovered his remains, curled in a forgotten cell beneath the stairs. Sometimes release was granted, but never delivered. A prisoner might be approved for freedom by a magistrate, only for the message to be delayed, redirected, or ignored. In 1371, a woman in Barcelona was granted pardon. The parchment was archived, but the jailer never received it. She died 2 winters later from exposure. The letter, preserved in wax seal, now rests in a museum. A ticket to freedom, never used. These forgotten prisoners are not relics of a different mindset. They are reflections of what happens when systems value order over compassion, procedure over people. When convenience becomes justice, and absence is easier to explain than truth. And yet, the human urge to leave a mark never disappeared. Some prisoners etched prayers into wood. Others scratched poems in Latin or vernacular tongue. One fragment, recovered from a cell wall in York, reads, "If I am not seen, I still speak. If I am not freed, I still breathe. If I am not named, I still am." It's not just a tragedy, it's a message. That humanity, even in confinement, insists on recognition. These prisoners weren't waiting for heroes. They were waiting for acknowledgement, for a name in the ledger, a face to remember them, a hand not to rescue, but to witness. And that, perhaps, is what we owe them. Memory. Not as a gesture of pity, but as a promise that silence won't win again, that no one should ever be erased because it was easier than asking what happened to them. History is full of noise, but it is the quiet stories, the forgotten ones, that teach us what justice is meant to be. The wall-scratched testimonies of doomed prisoners. Stone remembers. Long after the bodies are gone, long after the bones are dust, the walls still whisper. In dark corners of ruined castles, in the silent cells of forgotten dungeons, there are messages, scratched with nails, bones, or stolen bits of metal, words etched into stone by trembling hands, not for posterity, not for defiance, but for proof. I was here. I lived. I mattered. Across Europe, from Scotland to Sicily, dozens of medieval prisons still bear these marks. And while the languages vary, Latin, Old French, Middle English, the message is always the same: fear, hope, and the ache of being forgotten. In a cell beneath England's Lancaster Castle, someone carved, "Jesu mercy." 2 words, shallow, desperate. We don't know who wrote them, but the carving style matches the 14th century, and the graffiti is surrounded by tally marks, hundreds, maybe thousands, etched in rows across the stone. A calendar of suffering, a countdown to nowhere. In France, under the Château de Vincennes, names are scrawled in elegant medieval script. Pierre, son of Thibault, imprisoned by the will of the Duke. Below it, "Forgive them, Lord." No release record exists for a Pierre, son of Thibault, but his plea remains, carved into the wall of a chamber that hadn't seen daylight in centuries until its rediscovery during renovations in 1965. These weren't isolated cases. Graffiti was a prisoner's last language, their final way of asserting identity when the world had turned its back. Some scratched entire prayers, fragments of psalms, confessions, and blessings. Others drew crude saints or crosses, hoping perhaps their suffering would be noticed by a higher power, if not by a human judge. In Austria's Burg Kreuzenstein fortress, archaeologists found Latin inscriptions dating back to 1319. Noli timere mortem, fear not death. Below it, the barely legible Miserere me, Deus. Have mercy on me, O God. These were not men hardened by crime. Many were political prisoners, heretics, or merely unlucky. Some had spoken against the wrong noble. Others were scapegoats during plague outbreaks. Most were never given trials. What stands out is the humanity. Even after months or years in isolation, knowing death was more likely than freedom, these prisoners didn't scream in rage. They wrote to be remembered, to be forgiven, to be known. One of the most chilling discoveries came from the Tower of London. Deep in the Salt Tower, an elaborate engraving shows a rose with the words in Latin, "Amor vincit omnia," love conquers all. It's surrounded by smaller initials, believed to be those of multiple prisoners who shared the same cell across decades. Imagine that, a message of love, carved in a place of despair by people who knew they would never see the sky again. In medieval justice systems, imprisonment was rarely meant for rehabilitation. It was punishment, deterrence, erasure. And because trials were often symbolic, or skipped altogether, the prison walls became the only place where a prisoner could tell their story, or at least leave behind the hint of one. In some cases, the graffiti was made by women. At the Château de Loches in central France, one cell contained the words, "Marguerite, fille de Dieu," Margaret, daughter of God, alongside a crudely drawn heart pierced by an arrow. Nothing more. Her name doesn't appear in any noble records, but the jail cell is dated to around 1430, during a time of witch trials and religious hysteria. She likely died there. Modern researchers use light scanning and infrared to uncover more inscriptions hidden beneath centuries of grime. New names emerge every year, lost voices etched into oblivion. But the most heartbreaking are not the names or dates. They're the messages to loved ones. Tell my brother I am not afraid. Remember me to my mother. If my child lives, I have not died in vain. These are not the words of hardened criminals. They're human beings, torn from their lives, trapped in darkness, and reduced to whispers in stone. The sheer volume of this graffiti across Europe suggests a silent epidemic, not just of injustice, but of historical forgetting. These were people buried alive, erased from record, yet still shouting through stone and time that they were here, that they mattered. Today, tourists pass by these walls, often unaware. Guides point out the carvings, but few pause to think about what it meant to take your last strength, starved, beaten, alone, and use it not to escape, but to carve your soul into a wall. These prisoners will never be known by face or voice, but their words endure. They wrote their names when no one would speak them. They wrote their prayers when no one would listen, and they wrote their love when all else had been taken. The walls remember, and now, so do we. Somewhere, beneath layers of moss and dust, new carvings are still being found. Small names, desperate initials, a fading plea for mercy. Each one is a final breath made permanent, and each one reminds us, silence is not the end if someone is still willing to listen. Wrong identity, right punishment, executed for another man's crime. In the year 1386, in the bustling medieval city of Bruges, a man was hanged for a crime he did not commit. He was not a thief, nor a killer. He was simply unlucky, a traveler, weary from the road, arrested on suspicion, not because of anything he said or did, but because he bore a resemblance to someone else. And in a time when justice moved swiftly and identities were as fragile as parchment, that resemblance was all it took. The traveler's name is lost to time. No official record preserved it. What remains is the outline of his fate, an anonymous man who walked into a city expecting shelter and instead met the noose. Bruges, a commercial hub of medieval Flanders, was no stranger to crime. With wealth came desperation, and with desperation came mistakes, both by criminals and by those who pursued them. The local authorities were under pressure to maintain order, to deliver justice quickly. And when a robbery left one man dead in the marketplace, the people wanted answers. Swift answers. Witnesses, few, frantic, and likely wrong, describe the criminal in vague terms: medium build, traveling alone, dark cloak. The description fit dozens, if not hundreds, of men moving through Bruges. But it matched this traveler just closely enough to justify his arrest. He protested. He insisted on his innocence. He begged for time to prove it. But the machinery of medieval justice was grinding forward, deaf to pleas. The sheriff had his man. The public demanded action. In medieval Europe, particularly in cities like Bruges, the legal process was often brutal and frighteningly efficient. Trials could last hours. Sometimes there were no trials at all, only accusations, confessions under duress, and verdicts passed in dimly lit chambers where truth mattered less than resolution. The traveler was likely denied legal counsel, formal inquiry, or even the chance to speak freely in court. His fate was sealed by circumstance and appearances. He was imprisoned in one of the city's stone jails, where light barely touched the floors and the air reeked of old straw and mildew. Days passed. He continued to plead. Perhaps he thought someone would believe him. Perhaps he clung to hope that the real criminal would be caught in time. But the wheels of justice were not just blind, they were impatient. The execution was carried out in the town square. Records say it was swift, public, and meant to restore order. The crowd watched. Some may have cheered. Others likely averted their eyes. Among them may have been those who suspected the truth, who saw doubt in the man's face or confusion in his final words. But no one stopped it. His body was taken down before sunset. Another criminal, another punishment. The city could rest. But days later, everything unraveled. The real perpetrator was found in a nearby town, caught while attempting to sell stolen goods. He confessed easily, naming details only the true criminal could have known. When authorities compared the man's appearance to the executed traveler, the error was undeniable. The wrong man had died. An innocent had paid the ultimate price, not for what he had done, but for who he appeared to be. There was no compensation, no apology, no justice for the injustice. In those days, the law did not entertain regret. The man was buried without name, without ceremony, a footnote in someone else's confession. And Bruges moved on. Cases like this were not rare. In an era before fingerprints, photos, or formalized ID, mistaken identity was a silent killer. The color of your cloak, the way you walked, your silence, your accent, all could be twisted into evidence. And once the accusation was made, escaping it was like trying to outrun your own shadow. Across medieval Europe, wrongful executions were whispered of, but rarely challenged. To question a verdict was to question authority. And so fear silenced doubt. Public executions served a purpose beyond punishment. They were theater, reminders of order, and warnings of what awaited those who strayed, even if, as in Bruges, the person punished was innocent. The tragedy is that the man in 1386 was not executed for what he did. He was executed for what others thought he might be, a placeholder for guilt, a symbol for justice, a sacrifice to the illusion of control. And perhaps the greatest cruelty is this, that after he died, the city did not mourn him. It mourned the mistake, because the mistake made Bruges look foolish. It made the law look fallible. And in a world where power depended on certainty, fallibility was the greatest threat of all. So the man was buried quietly, his name never recorded, his voice never heard again. Justice, they said, had been served. This execution in Bruges was not an isolated misstep. It was a symptom of a wider problem in medieval jurisprudence. Without centralized police, without consistent legal representation, and in the absence of any systematic investigation, the justice system often ran on assumptions, on urgency, and on fear. To the authorities, delay looked like indecision, doubt looked like weakness, and the wrong man, tragically, looked close enough to right. Tales of mistaken identity, like that of the 1386 traveler, echoed in the literature and sermons of the time, cautionary whispers buried in scrolls and margins. They were rarely front and center, because to dwell on such errors was dangerous. It questioned divine order, questioned rulers, questioned the very scaffolding of control that held medieval society together. But they were there, recorded by monks who dared speak softly of injustice, by foreign visitors who raised eyebrows, and by families who never stopped grieving behind closed doors. Justice in those times was not blind, it was hasty, and in its haste, it often blurred the line between accusation and proof, between appearance and truth, between punishment and irreparable tragedy. And so, when we remember the man who died in Bruges in 1386, we remember more than an error. We remember a system where the wheel of justice turned too quickly to see who it crushed. We remember a city that mourned not the man, but the embarrassment. We remember a death not because it was unique, but because it was not. Let that silence echo. Let it remind us that the wrong face in the wrong place should never again be enough to hang a name on guilt. The jailer's rule: torture before justice. Before the judge raised a gavel, before a lawyer opened their mouth, before a prisoner even saw the inside of a courtroom, justice had already begun. Not in a legal sense, not in fairness, but in practice. And behind those stone prison walls, justice had little to do with law. Because inside many medieval and early modern prisons, the jailer was not a keeper of order. He was a king. He controlled the food, the water, the air. He decided who would speak and who would scream. Prison was not a place where you waited for trial. It was a business, and every prisoner was a commodity. The jailer's rule was simple: bribes opened doors, silence closed them, and pain was a tool of convenience. Historical accounts from prisons across England, France, and Italy tell a chilling truth. Inmates were often tortured before any legal process began, not to extract truth, but to force confessions, to make things easier, faster, cheaper. In an age where courts were overwhelmed and slow, a confession was gold. Whether it was true didn't matter. And so they squeezed. Take Newgate Prison in London. In the 17th century, it was infamous for its filth, disease, and brutality. If you arrived with money, you could buy better bedding, food, even avoid the company of violent criminals. If you arrived poor, you were at the mercy of the jailer's generosity, which rarely existed. Guards beat inmates regularly, not as punishment, but as expectation. The phrase, "money for the chain," became common. It meant you paid not to be shackled. Couldn't afford it? The chain stayed on. Or worse, they tightened. Food, rationed. Water, contaminated. Sanitation, non-existent. But the worst part was the questioning. There are records of jailers who acted as unofficial interrogators. Before any official examination, prisoners were encouraged to confess. Encouraged with fists, with clubs, with hunger, with sleep deprivation. Some prisoners broke quickly. Others were made examples of. Confessions extracted this way weren't just morally compromised, they were legal. As long as the words were spoken aloud and witnessed, they were accepted. No one asked how the words were dragged out, only that they were said. And this wasn't limited to England. In the Bastille of France, nobles and political enemies were kept in isolation, sometimes without any charges filed. Jailers had full discretion over how they were treated. Some were driven mad from solitary confinement. Others were interrogated in private chambers without any record. Some whispered of scream rooms, spaces where the stone absorbed the sound so no one outside could hear. What was the goal? Efficiency, control, fear. Justice moved faster when the accused admitted guilt, and even faster when someone else was blamed. Many jailers were incentivized to extract usable information. The faster they delivered a confession, the sooner the case could be closed, and the prisoner dealt with. Torture was not always dramatic. It was often casual: a beating during meals, a forced march in chains, a denial of food until the correct answers were offered. Psychological torture was common, too. Prisoners told their families had abandoned them. Letters withheld, execution dates falsely announced, then delayed, hope offered, and ripped away. There were stories of prisoners confessing to crimes they hadn't committed just to make the torment stop. Some did it for food, others for warmth. One man in 1608 confessed to 3 different crimes under 3 different names, just to end the beatings. This wasn't justice, it was paperwork, streamlined by fear. Some jailers grew rich. They charged inmates for everything: water, candles, blankets, access to visitors. A prisoner's survival depended less on their innocence and more on their wealth. And when jailers were replaced, the violence didn't stop, it adapted. In some regions, guards passed down effective techniques, tricks of pressure points, methods of isolation, even scripts for guiding a prisoner toward a believable confession. Reform came slowly. Centuries passed before official torture was outlawed in most of Europe, but the culture remained. Even into the 19th century, the idea that prisoners deserved suffering persisted, that if you were behind bars, you must have done something wrong. And so the rule of the jailer lived on, not in laws, but in shadows. Because for much of history, a confession was not a truth. It was a survival tactic, a trade, your dignity for your life. And the jailer? He was judge, jury, and tormentor, all before justice ever knocked. Noble hostages, children locked up for their parents' loyalty. What happens when innocence becomes the price of power? In medieval courts, loyalty was not secured by oaths alone. It was bought with flesh and blood, often the tender flesh of children. Lords and kings demanded hostages. Sons and daughters handed over as guarantees that their parents would obey treaties, pay taxes, or refrain from rebellion. These were not the scions of common peasants, but the heirs of powerful houses, eyes wide with fear, hearts burning with confusion. Imagine a 6-year-old boy, dressed in finery too large for his shoulders, stepping from his father's carriage into the shadowed stone corridors of a distant castle. His mother's tears still warm on his cheek, he stalls at the threshold. He is ushered past iron-studded doors, into a cell without toys, without laughter, without the comfort of his cradle. His only companions, echoing footsteps on cold floors, the flicker of torchlight on damp walls, and the knowledge that beyond these walls his family's fate hangs by a thread. In England in 1215, after King John agreed to the Magna Carta, 40 hostages, many still children, were sent to ensure the barons upheld their end of the bargain. Some were kept in Windsor Castle's lower wards, where winter winds cut through cracks in the walls. Bread was meager, bedding was straw, and a single blanket was shared among them. When spring arrived, not every boy had survived the cold. The chronicles record pale faces and broken bodies returned home, pledged to their families, but forever changed by what they endured. In France, during the 100 Years' War, hostages were a commonplace currency. In 1412, Charles of Orleans, age 16, was captured at Agincourt and spent 25 years in captivity. Though as a prince his conditions were better, he still endured isolation, exchanged only for cooked meat and wine rather than the bread and water doled out to lesser captives. His mother's pleas echoed unanswered through the stone halls. His letters, written on ragged scraps, carried sorrow across borders. But it was in the forests of Wales that hostage children might have fared worst. Princes sent their sons to royal courts in London, trusting in chivalric codes of honor. Yet those codes were broken. Young boys watched as their tutors were beaten for their fathers' missed payments. They learned to measure time by the drip of water from ceiling stones, by the toll of a distant bell calling men to mass, a ritual marking another month of captivity. In Italy, city-states like Venice and Genoa held not just sons but daughters, betrothed to secure alliances. Noble hostages, children locked up for their parents' loyalty. What happens when innocence becomes the price of power? In medieval courts, loyalty was not secured by oaths alone. It was bought with flesh and blood, often the tender flesh of children. Lords and kings demanded hostages. Sons and daughters handed over as guarantees that their parents would obey treaties, pay taxes, or refrain from rebellion. These were not the scions of common peasants, but the heirs of powerful houses, eyes wide with fear, hearts burning with confusion. Imagine a 6-year-old boy, dressed in finery too large for his shoulders, stepping from his father's carriage into the shadowed stone corridors of a distant castle. His mother's tears still warm on his cheek, he stalls at the threshold. He is ushered past iron-studded doors into a cell without toys, without laughter, without the comfort of his cradle. His only companions, echoing footsteps on cold floors, the flicker of torchlight on damp walls, and the knowledge that beyond these walls his family's fate hangs by a thread. In England, in 1215, after King John agreed to the Magna Carta, 40 hostages, many still children, were sent to ensure the barons upheld their end of the bargain. Some were kept in Windsor Castle's lower wards, where winter winds cut through cracks in the walls. Bread was meager, bedding was straw, and a single blanket was shared among them. When spring arrived, not every boy had survived the cold. The chronicles record pale faces and broken bodies returned home, pledged to their families but forever changed by what they endured. In France, during the 100 Years' War, hostages were a commonplace currency. In 1412, Charles of Orleans, age 16, was captured at Agincourt and spent 25 years in captivity. Though as a prince, his conditions were better, he still endured isolation, exchanged only for cooked meat and wine, rather than the bread and water doled out to lesser captives. His mother's pleas echoed unanswered through the stone halls. His letters, written on ragged scraps, carried sorrow across borders. But it was in the forests of Wales that hostage children might have fared worst. Princes sent their sons to royal courts in London, trusting in chivalric codes of honor. Yet those codes were broken. Young boys watched as their tutors were beaten for their father's missed payments. They learned to measure time by the drip of water from ceiling stones, by the toll of a distant bell calling men to mass, a ritual marking another month of captivity. In Italy, city-states like Venice and Genoa held not just sons but daughters, betrothed to secure alliances. And a girl might be married on paper to a stranger she had never met, her rights stripped to guarantee her city's safe passage of ships laden with grain. She lived in palaces that glittered outside but felt like gilded cages within, her only crime being born to power. Medieval law justified the practice by code, lex talionis, the law of retaliation. If a lord broke his word, his child's life was forfeit. But legal theory and lived reality diverged. Children grew pale and silent. Their tongues forgot laughter. Their eyes saw shadows where none existed. Some chroniclers note that a few hostages were treated kindly, educated in courtly manners, taught languages, granted tutors. Yet kindness was capricious. A change in treaty, a rumor of rebellion, and the boy might be dragged back to the oubliette, the hidden dungeon, never again to walk under open sky. When negotiations finally ended, the release of hostages could be as brutal as their capture. A father agreeing to terms might weep upon seeing his child shrunken, mute, ghostly. Reunions were fractious. Years of forced loyalty had twisted emotions. Some children, raised, in part, by rival courts, spoke unfamiliar tongues. They knew their home only in dreams. And yet, the practice continued for centuries. In the Holy Roman Empire, princes sent their heirs to imperial diets, where they sat in princely splendor by day and were shackled in chambers by night. In 1526, Ferdinand of Austria was taken to Spain, groomed as a royal hostage, until his accession to the throne, when he returned, a man forged by captivity into an emperor. Through it all, medieval chronicles record little compassion. Hostages were transactions. Their pain was collateral damage in the great game of power. Their childhoods were lent out, their suffering assumed acceptable so long as orders were obeyed. Today, when we look back, we see more than scandal. We see the human cost of political bargains. We see children whose loyalty was demanded before it was earned. We see echoes in modern hostageships and diplomatic detentions, where politics still traffics in human lives. When you walk through a medieval castle today, notice the tiny doorways chiseled for children. Imagine them clutching a coin or a piece of bread. Listen for their footsteps in the empty corridors. Remember that power once wore a child's face, as hostage, as promise, as living oath. And ask, have we truly left that practice behind? Or do we still stake lives on the unraveling threads of treaties, willing to lock up innocence until the world decides to let go? The iron collar punishment, chained in the courtyard for days. Imagine being bound to a wall, not inside a cell, but outside, in full view of everyone who passes. Your neck locked in a ring of cold iron, heavy and unrelenting. You can't sit comfortably. You can't lie down. The collar is bolted to a post or to stone. Rain lashes your face. Wind claws at your skin. And people walk by, not to help, but to stare. Some throw scraps. Some throw stones. Others just whisper. This is your punishment. Not imprisonment, but exposure. Not silence, but shame. The iron collar was one of the cruelest tools in medieval punishment. It wasn't designed to kill. It wasn't designed to maim. It was designed to break you in the eyes of others. Found in the castles of France, the fortresses of England, the bastions of the Holy Roman Empire, this was humiliation sculpted into metal. You could be sentenced to wear the iron collar for a day or a week. Some wore it longer. You were chained to a courtyard post or a gate, sometimes beside the marketplace, sometimes directly beneath the windows of the court. You were to be seen. The crime? Petty theft, insolence, gossip, debts. Even refusing to kneel properly before a noble could earn you a turn in the collar. The collar was iron, but the sentence was shame. These collars were not uniform. Some were simple iron rings bolted shut. Others were decorated with mocking designs, shaped like animal heads or painted with symbols of your offense. One record from 14th century Rouen describes a woman made to wear a collar with a bell, so no one could miss her presence. Every movement, a clang of guilt. It wasn't just the collar. Sometimes your wrists were shackled, or your feet. Sometimes a sign was hung around your neck, detailing your crime in crude Latin or the local dialect. Liar. Thief. Unchaste. In England, branding was sometimes added to the ritual, an initial scorched onto the forehead or cheek, so even when the collar came off, the label remained, and weather was part of the punishment. In summer, the metal seared skin. In winter, it froze to flesh. There was no shelter, no warmth, no mercy. Food, if any, was left near your feet. You had to find a way to reach it. Water dripped from eaves or came from sympathetic hands, though some offered nothing but insults. Children laughed, dogs barked, birds defecated from above. You became part of the scenery, part of the warning, a living signpost for what happens to those who disrupt the order. But even worse was the social aftershock. People remembered. A noble's servant seen in the collar was rarely rehired. A young woman so punished might never marry. A merchant accused of cheating and locked in iron often returned to an empty stall and a vanished clientele. The punishment extended far beyond the days spent outside. It poisoned futures. Yet for all its cruelty, it was often considered merciful compared to whipping, mutilation, or execution. The collar didn't shed blood. It didn't destroy bone. It only destroyed dignity. And in medieval society, dignity was everything. Prison records from 13th century Paris describe collars embedded into courtyard walls, iron rings worn smooth by hundreds of necks over decades. One was known as the talker's ring, reserved for those who insulted clergy or spoke against the king. Another, simply called the chain, was placed beside the castle kitchens, used to punish those who stole food. One boy, aged 15, was sentenced to 5 days there for taking bread meant for dogs. And there were those who didn't survive. Exposure could lead to infection, pneumonia, or collapse. A prisoner who fainted might choke against the collar. In rare cases, birds pecked at wounds. One tale from Eastern Europe tells of a man left so long in the collar, his skin grew over part of the iron. When they finally removed it, he could no longer lift his head properly. Eventually, some cities abolished the practice, replacing it with indoor stocks or labor sentences. But in rural areas, the collar persisted into the 17th century, not because it was effective, but because it was visible. And fear, after all, was the goal. The legacy remains. Some castle walls still bear rusted rings. Museums preserve the collars, some still bearing scratches from desperate hands. The punishment is long gone. But the mindset? The belief that humiliation corrects behavior, that public shaming is justice, that idea is harder to erase. Today, we call it different names: online ridicule, doxing, cancel culture. But the impulse is ancient: to make someone kneel in the square of public opinion and watch as everyone walks by. To teach by spectacle. To correct through cruelty. There are even cases where the collar was used repeatedly, on the same person, for minor infractions. One beggar in Bristol was sentenced to the collar once per month for 3 years, each time after being caught asking for food without permission. Local children mocked him as the ringman, And when he died, his burial was denied in church grounds for being a creature of shame. His story appears only in a footnote, but his suffering was real. In other towns, collared prisoners were forced to sing hymns or confess aloud as part of their punishment. In Verona, a man was made to recite his crimes on repeat from dawn until dusk, his voice cracking, his knees trembling. When he faltered, he was struck with a rod. This ritual was called penance through proclamation. But what it really achieved was fear, not reform, not remorse, just submission. And perhaps that was the collar's true purpose, not to make better citizens, but obedient ones, the kind that knew their place, the kind that bowed, the kind that feared stepping out of line, not because of conscience, but because of what the iron ring would feel like in winter. So remember the rusted collar, not as a relic of a brutal past, but as a reminder of what happens when power chooses spectacle over soul. The world doesn't need more rings of iron. It needs hands that break them. Prisoners used as castle labor. In the shadows of medieval castles, behind towering walls and guarded gates, a hidden workforce toiled. Prisoners. Not criminals in the modern sense, but pawns of power. Sentenced not for justice, but for forced labor. Many were imprisoned not to pay debts or crimes, but simply to provide free, expendable labor to the lords who held the keys. Castles were monumental projects, vast stone fortresses built to dominate the landscape and crush rebellion. Yet their grandeur was forged on the backs of those shackled within their dungeons and courtyards. Prisoners, often chained together, were pressed into grueling work, hauling massive stones, building walls, digging moats, and clearing the ever-present filth and refuse that gathered in castle yards and latrines. This was no prison sentence of rest or reflection. It was a sentence of relentless, back-breaking labor under brutal supervision. The chains were a constant reminder of their bondage, restricting movement but not breaking spirit, though many spirits would break, crushed under the weight of exhaustion, hunger, and cruelty. Records from castles across Europe, England, France, Germany, and beyond tell stories of such forced labor. The Tower of London's archives describe inmates chained in pairs, hauling stones up steep ramps for the building's extension. At Château de Chinon in France, prisoners cleared swamps and dug the castle's massive moat by hand, often sinking into the mud themselves. This labor was more than just punishment. It was a system designed to extract maximum utility from those the state or nobility considered disposable. Many prisoners were caught in cycles of poverty or political strife, rounded up during wars or purges, or convicted of minor offenses that barely warranted incarceration but offered cheap muscle for castle maintenance and defense. The conditions were appalling. Shackled wrists and ankles caused infections and sores. The cold stone floors of dungeons were their beds. Food was meager and often rotten, barely enough to sustain such exhausting work. Guards were ruthless. Any slip, any sign of weakness, any failure to perform invited cruel punishments or death. One documented case from the late 14th century recounts prisoners at a fortress in Bavaria who were forced to haul heavy stones uphill in winter. When a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion, a guard ordered his chained partner to drag him back to the cell or be executed. Stories like this are not rare, but emblematic of the era's brutal realities. The labor wasn't limited to construction. Prisoners were tasked with cleaning the castle sewers, dark, disease-ridden tunnels that ran beneath the stone floors. These men and women, shackled and exhausted, risked deadly infections daily. The smell of human waste mixed with the stench of stagnant water was suffocating. Many never survived these grueling duties. Despite the brutality, there was a grim system of hierarchy among prisoners. Some might be assigned lighter tasks or work under less harsh conditions if they were skilled craftsmen, like masons or carpenters. But such privileges were rare and often revoked for the slightest infraction. The use of prisoners as forced laborers was intertwined with medieval concepts of justice and social control. Punishment was not solely about retribution, but also about reinforcing social order through physical domination. The visibility of prisoners working in chains was a warning to others, a spectacle of power that declared, "This is what happens to those who defy authority." Many prisoners never left the castle alive. Exhaustion, disease, injury, or execution claimed their lives long before any formal sentence ended. Their names were rarely recorded. Their existence vanished except for the scars they left on the stones they labored over, and sometimes in graffiti scratched on dungeon walls. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of this labor in wear patterns on castle stones, mass graves near construction sites, and tools left behind. Rusted shackles found alongside broken hammers and chisels. Together, these remnants paint a haunting picture of toil intertwined with oppression. Yet, within this darkness, flickers of resistance glimmered. Some prisoners attempted escape, while others subtly sabotaged construction. Loose stones, poorly dug moats, acts of defiance that risked brutal punishment. Oral histories and folklore across Europe remember these acts as quiet rebellions, moments where human spirit challenged the chains. Understanding this history is vital. The castles that stand today, symbols of power, strength, and heritage, were built upon suffering unseen by the tourists who walk their halls. The stones tell stories not just of kings and knights, but of the countless prisoners who labored chained and broken, invisible yet integral to the medieval world. Their toil, their pain, their silent endurance remain carved into history, a testament to the harsh realities behind the grandeur. And though forgotten by most, their story is one of resilience amid oppression, a stark reminder of the human cost behind the castle's cold walls. The prison cart, where the sick and dying were dumped. In the shadowed streets of medieval Europe, when a prisoner grew too weak to stand, too sick to shuffle on foot, or too broken to face the public gaze, there was one grim fate that awaited them: the prison cart. These carts were no mere transport. They were vehicles of despair, rolling tombs designed to carry the sick, the dying, and the forgotten from one holding place to another. The prison cart was a battered wooden wagon, often pulled by a weary horse or ox, its wheels creaking under the weight of human suffering. Its sides might be barred or covered with rough planks, but the air inside was stale, suffocating, thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and decay. Within this moving cell, prisoners who could no longer walk were tossed like cargo, some still alive, gasping for breath, others already close to death, their bodies ravaged by disease, malnutrition, and neglect. In many medieval towns and cities, the justice system was brutal and rudimentary. Prisoners awaiting trial, sentencing, or execution were held in overcrowded jails with poor sanitation and minimal care. Illness spread quickly: plague, typhus, dysentery, turning dungeons into death traps. Once a prisoner became too ill to be moved by foot, the prison cart was summoned, its arrival dreaded by inmates and citizens alike. The cart did not discriminate. It collected from castles, city jails, and roadside holding cells, gathering those condemned to wait or die. It passed through villages and hamlets, a harbinger of misery and finality. Villagers would step aside or shutter their windows as the cart rumbled past, carrying the unwanted, the forsaken, the unloved. To see the prison cart approach was to witness death's approach, slow, inevitable, and merciless. Prisoners inside often faced hours or days on the road in the cart's suffocating confines, exposed to weather, jostled by uneven roads, and abandoned to their own suffering. Some were shackled hand and foot. Others, too weak even to be restrained, lay helpless. Stories survive of prisoners pleading for water or mercy through the cracks in the wood, only to be ignored by indifferent guards or passers-by. The cart's destinations were grim. Often it would arrive at a central holding prison, a gallows site, or a hospital designated for the condemned, the spittle or pest house, where the sick were isolated and left to die, away from the public eye. There was no expectation of recovery, no offer of comfort, only the grim calculus of managing the living dead. Families rarely knew the fate of loved ones once they entered the cart. Communication was minimal, and hope was scarce. One chronicler of the 15th century described the arrival of a prison cart at a town's gate. It came like a rolling coffin, its passengers cloaked in silence and sorrow. The stench was unbearable, and the sight broke the hearts of the strong. This vivid image echoes across accounts. These carts were symbols of society's failure and cruelty. The use of prison carts reveals much about medieval attitudes toward punishment and death. The sick and dying were not gently cared for. They were treated as burdens to be moved swiftly and unseen. Compassion was rare. The system prioritized order and containment over humanity. The prison cart became a mobile reminder that justice was harsh and mercy was a luxury few could afford. In some places, the arrival of the cart marked the final moments for prisoners who would be executed soon after, sometimes publicly displayed to warn others. In others, it was simply a transfer between prisons or to infirmaries where death was all but guaranteed. The cart's journey was often the last in a procession of cruelty that began with arrest and ended in silence. Though technology and justice have evolved, the image of the prison cart remains a haunting testament to medieval cruelty. It forces us to remember those who suffered beyond the public eye, those whose final days were spent confined in a rattling cage, carried through towns and villages, never spoken of again. The prison cart was not just a vehicle, it was a symbol of forgotten lives, lost to history, but etched forever in the darker chapters of human justice. And so, when you imagine the wheels of that cart turning slowly down ancient cobblestones, carrying souls too weak to resist, know that behind the creak and groan was a story of suffering and neglect, of a world where mercy was chained, and the sick and dying were cast aside like broken tools. Confess or be tortured again. Endless loops of pain. In the hidden depths of medieval prisons and dungeons across Europe, a relentless torment took place that defied simple notions of punishment or justice. It was a cycle without end, a loop designed to crush the human spirit and break the will of any prisoner unlucky enough to be caught within it. The goal was singular, merciless: extract a confession. Truth was irrelevant. Guilt or innocence did not matter. Only one thing was demanded: confess. And if you refused, the torture would return, again and again and again. Imagine the prisoner's world. Imagine waking each day, not knowing if it would be the last day before release or the first day back on the rack. The certainty of agony awaited like a shadow stalking every step. You are stripped of all hope of fairness, tossed into a limbo where pain replaces judgment. There are no advocates, no lawyers, no witnesses, only jailers and interrogators who wield cruelty as their only weapon. The cycle began with a violent session. The rack pulled tight until bones groaned, the thumbscrews crushed, or the iron boot squeezed a limb with excruciating precision. Some endured the strappado, suspended by the wrists with agonizing pressure on the shoulders. Others faced the water torture, suffocating beneath cold water in endless seconds that felt like eternity. The exact methods varied by place and era, but the horror was universal. After this first brutal encounter, the prisoner might be released back to their cell, but it was a release only in name. For many, it was a mere pause before the inevitable return. Some survived weeks, months, or even years in this repeating cycle, each session sapping more strength, each confession more coerced. Historical records from notorious sites like the Tower of London, the Bastille, and the Inquisition archives tell a grim tale of this endless loop. In one account, a prisoner recounted, "They come for me like clockwork. Every week, like a cruel tide, they pull me apart and put me back together. I confess to sins I do not know, names I do not speak, crimes never committed." The confession was a key to temporary respite, a fragile shield against the next wave of torment. but the confession itself was often a trap. Prisoners were forced not only to admit guilt, but to implicate others, friends, family, innocents. These forced denunciations extended the cycle of pain, expanding the circle of suffering beyond the cell walls. It was a dark calculus of power. One broken person's testimony condemned many more. Some interrogators employed psychological warfare as viciously as physical. Sleep deprivation was routine, days or nights without rest, eyes burning, body trembling. Food was withheld to weaken the body and cloud the mind. Isolation compounded the torment. Prisoners were cut off from any human contact, left alone with their fears and hallucinations. "You'll say it eventually" became a chilling mantra whispered in cell blocks and interrogation chambers alike, a promise and a threat wrapped in one. The prison itself became a machine for erasing identity. The man or woman who entered was transformed through endless pain into a husk of their former self. Madness claimed many. Some begged to die as an escape from the unbearable repetition. Others clung to their false confessions as lifelines, bargaining their souls for moments of peace. This method of forcing confessions also exposed a terrifying vulnerability of justice in that era. Courts relied heavily on confession as the gold standard of guilt, often disregarding the methods used to procure them. Torture was not merely a means to an end. It became the end itself, the foundation upon which verdicts and executions were built. Innocent or guilty, the confession decided life or death. Yet, this horrific system also bore witness to resilience. Some prisoners resisted with unimaginable strength, enduring cycles of pain without yielding their truth. Their silence was a protest, a flicker of dignity in a world designed to erase it. Many did not survive this resistance, but their courage echoes in the annals of history. The legacy of these endless loops of pain lingers today as a reminder of the darkest abuses of power. It warns us of what happens when justice becomes a performance, when human dignity is sacrificed for efficiency, when fear replaces fairness. Modern legal protections, human rights laws, and international conventions against torture stand as bulwarks against this legacy. But understanding the depth of suffering endured reminds us why these protections are vital. Listening to these stories, we are forced to confront the fragile line between order and cruelty, between law and tyranny. We are reminded that justice without compassion is hollow, and power without accountability is dangerous. And above all, we remember the countless souls who suffered in silence, caught in an endless loop of pain, tortured not just for their bodies, but falsely accused by the church. The servants branded as heretics. What if speaking a careless word cost you your freedom and your faith? In late medieval Europe, the Inquisition stood as the Church's iron fist, wielding power over both highborn and lowly. Its reach extended into villages, towns, and the poorest quarters of every city, where servants, laborers, and tavern keepers lived close to survival's edge. Many of them could neither read nor write Latin, let alone understand Scripture. Yet they found themselves branded as heretics over gossip, misheard phrases, or the suspicions of a neighbor. Imagine a washerwoman in her stained gown, bending over a wooden trough of sudsy water at dawn. She hums a hymn learned in childhood, but mispronounces a Latin word. A passing friar, vigilant against error, notes her slip in a small leather notebook. Later, she is seized, bound, and dragged through narrow streets to a candlelit tribunal. The judge is an inquisitor in dark robes, his face hollowed by fervor. He reads the charges that she doubted the doctrine of transubstantiation, insulted the clergy, and uttered seditious comments. She protests that she never understood what she sang, but her voice is lost beneath the clatter of iron tools laid out just beyond the curtain. Behind that curtain lies the torture chamber. Instruments gleam in flickering torchlight, the strappado rack, where arms are tied behind the back and the body is lifted until joints tear. iron thumbscrews that twist fingers into pulp, and the water cradle, where a cloth is forced into the mouth and water poured until the prisoner chokes. The inquisitors claimed these torments sought only truth, but truth and violence cannot coexist. They ask again, "Are you guilty?" Each no brings a tightening of ropes, another turn of the screw, a drop of sweat falling into the dust. Eventually, the servant breaks. She confesses to crimes she never understood, words scripted by her torturers. That confession is scrawled in Latin, sealed with the inquisitor's ring, and filed away as proof of divine justice. She is whipped through the streets, her back lacerated, her spirit broken. Imprisoned for years in a dank cell, she is fed only bread and water. When she emerges, she is a husk, her body scarred and her mind haunted. But the Inquisition moves on to its next victim. A stable boy overhears a patron mocking the church's wealth. A brewer's wife laughs at a friar's sermon. A cook sings a forbidden hymn. Each is accused by neighbors eager, or terrified, to speak. Accusations spread by word of mouth, amplified in confessions extracted by fear. Once charged, the accused face the same grim fate: torture, forced confession, public humiliation, and years in prison. Records from Spain show that between 1480 and 1530, thousands, many of them servants, were tried. Some were burned at the stake, others condemned to life in oubliettes under castle keeps, where darkness was as deadly as any blade. Families were fined beyond their means, estates were confiscated, children were left orphaned. Those who survived carried the stigma of heresy their entire lives, unable to marry, barred from certain trades, shunned by everyone who had once known them. Yet the legal theory of the time justified these horrors under lex talionis and papal law. Heresy was seen as a wound to the body of Christendom, punishable by any means. Torture was sanctioned by decretals. Prisons were endorsed by royal edicts. No distinction was made between noble dissidents and lowly servants. Both could be labeled witches, schismatics, or spies for the devil. Gradually, however, the tide turned. Humanists and early reformers questioned the morality of torture. Secular courts began to assert jurisdiction, overturning inquisitorial verdicts. The printing press spread critiques of ecclesiastical abuses. Philosophers argued that faith must be free to be true. Yet for those servants branded as heretics, vindication never came. Their names vanished into dusty ledgers. Their coerced confessions lie hidden in vaults. Their suffering is remembered only by the echoes of abandoned dungeons and the splintered wood of old rack rooms. When you walk through a medieval town today, notice the arches where processions once marched, the heavy doors of former bishoprics, the stones stained by centuries of faith and fear. Listen for the faint drip of water seeping through masonry, like tears. Remember that behind those walls an idle word could become a noose, a simple doubt could become a brand, and a servant's life could be sacrificed on the altar of unquestioned power. Because when authority demands silence, every whisper becomes a threat, and every innocent word a weapon. Ask yourself, if fear still governs confession, if power still police belief, have we truly moved beyond those dark ages? Or do we continue to jail voices that dare to question, even in the quiet corners of taverns and workshops?